Okay, well, welcome everyone. My name is Holly Borum. This book party is sponsored by the Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography associated with the Rare Book School at UVA. The purpose of our book parties is to celebrate the wonderful work of our fellows, and today we're going to be hearing from Senior Fellow Megan Robb. So right now, this is just a reminder to keep yourself muted until the Q&A. You're welcome to have your video on or off, whatever you prefer. So Megan Robb is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Her work investigates Islam in South Asia, viewed from the perspective of Urdu print publics. She presses on issues that illuminate the religious identity of Muslims. Her first book, Print and the Urdu Public, Muslims, Newspapers, and Urban Life, was published with Oxford University Press in October 2020. Her current book project expands on her article on Elizabeth Sharaf un-Nisa Ducarel, published this spring with the American Historical Review. And we'll be hearing much more about this important historical figure today. Yael Rice is a senior fellow in Rare Book School's Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography, as well as associate professor of art history and of Asian languages and civilizations at Amherst College. She specializes in the art and architecture of South Asia, Central Asia, and Iran, with a particular focus on manuscripts and other portable arts of the 15th through 18th centuries. She is the author of the recently published The Brush of Insight, Artist and Agency at the Mughal Court, published through the University of Washington Press this year. As for the format today, Megan will give a short presentation about her digital humanities project, and then Yael will lead the conversation with Megan. Please feel free to drop questions into the chat as we go along. In about 40 minutes, Yael will wrap up and I'll start posing your questions to Megan. You're also welcome at that point to come off mute and ask your questions out loud, so either in the chat or verbally. So at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Megan, and thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today.
Thank you, Holly, for that warm and generous introduction. And thank you, Yael, for engaging with this project and being here for this gathering today to kick off the discussion. And thank you, Catherine, also for doing so much work to help make this book, this celebration happen. So I'll start off with a short introduction into what the project, who Elizabeth Sharaf un-Nisa Ducarel is, what I ended up discovering, and then take you on a short tour of this website, which I often refer to as a digital exhibit. So in the late 18th century, a Mughal woman named Sharaf un-Nisa, and I'm going to put, share my screen. One moment, I forgot to share my screen first. There we go. If you can all see that. So in the late 18th century, a Mughal woman named Sharaf un-Nisa lived with and 4 children by the first company supervisor of Purnea in what was then the British India. She followed him to Britain, changed her name to Elizabeth, and converted to Christianity. We know in scholarship on colonial period South Asia that cohabitations between native women and British East India Company servants were common. And so scholars have attempted to compensate for what really is a very well-known dearth of information about these native women's lives by reading East India Company archives. And while those remain a very rich source of information, and certainly much better than nothing, what's beautiful and wonderful about this archive is that material evidence of this woman's life, as well as textual evidence, lends insight into what for this person was an embodied process of Anglicization. So it's a really rare record of what it was like for a Mughal woman to in a very thorough way, become English. This website is meant to be looked at, engaged with alongside an article that I wrote and was published with the American Historical Review. And I will put a link to that in the chat just in case you're interested in saving that for later and engaging with it. And it's also, this project is also the focus of my second book in progress. But in the article, I looked at, I conducted textual material analysis of a range of materials, including private correspondence in English and Persian, material analysis of paintings, jewelry, textiles, and the penmanship notebook, where in the 1790s, Elizabeth Sharaf un-Nisa learned and taught herself how to write in English calligraphy. And ultimately, this project as a whole is interested in thinking about the subjectivity of this particular woman as a process of transformation that's characterized by hybridity. So not something that is taking for granted that there's some sort of essential cultured essence that stays consistent from place to place, but instead being taken very seriously the way that subjectivities are transformed through exposure to new cultural material. So that's the overall project as a whole. So then I'd like to talk about what this digital exhibit is and how it interacts and works in service of those research goals, but also provides pedagogical materials that will hopefully allow you and hopefully your colleagues to engage with this archive and use it in your teaching as well as your research. So I will want to go to the introduction. So briefly, and under the introduction tab, which is where I'm starting, I mentioned quickly that this is the culmination of many years of work and the work of many people who I am definitely going to thank with gratitude at the very end of this short introduction, to discover, document, and digitize the archival remnants of this woman. And so you can also listen to a podcast that talks about it as well. And this project first began in 2014 when a member of the Baltimore family, it was a cousin in the family by the name of Fergus Madden, reached out to me while I was working as the lecturer of Urdu and Hindi at the University of Oxford in England. He reached out to me to say that his family had a number of letters in their possession, and no one in the family was sure what language they were written in. And he asked if I would be willing to take a look just in case the letters were in Urdu and I could read them. So I met with Fergus. We determined that I would take a trip to their home, the home of Lord and Lady Palmer in Honiton in Devonshire. And when I arrived, I was thrilled to see 18 pristinely preserved 18th century Persian letters, a penmanship notebook where Elizabeth Sharaf un-Nisa Ducarel taught herself to write English, as well as a number of other material items, a miniature painting of her, a painting of her husband, of her son, and textiles, a perfume container, and jewelry. The materials I noticed cut across typical storage practices of archival materials. So some of that material fit very well into a traditional library collection. The correspondence, the penmanship notebook. However, there were also other stories that told extremely meaningful tales about fragments of Elizabeth Sharaf un-Nisa's life, but didn't fit very neatly into the same archival practices. And for those of you in the room who work with South Asian historiography, and also those of you who probably work with women's histories across other contexts, in the context of trying to record or find out more about histories of women in South Asia, since women did not tend to be literate or have access to literacy, the stories of their lives were more often told through alternate vocabularies, textiles, jewelry, scent selection, and other items that either are left out of traditional archives entirely or become relegated to the realm of ephemera. And so I will take you here to a link that shows you where you can browse the collection. So if you're browsing on your own, this is just under the browse link, but I'll also put it in the chat as well. And this is probably the most fun way to engage, is just to take a little gander, wander around, and click on some of the images and see what strikes your interest. And so if we look at the penmanship notebook, for example, I'm clicking on it here. This is the cover. And just to give you some guidance of how to engage with it, if you want to look at different pages, you need to engage with this bottom scroll bar on the bottom, because if you click on one of these links, it will just go to the next item. So we can see here Mrs. Ducarel's book, and then underneath it, Mrs. Ducarel's book. And so what's happened here is her penmanship instructor has written one of these, and then she has written the same phrase as a form of practice. And so you can look and see her beginning at the very beginning of the alphabet and practicing some of her words. So at first, when I looked at the materials in the Palmer's collection, I wasn't really sure what I was looking at because the family first told me that this was an account of a Hindu Maharaja's daughter who was rescued from the funeral pyre of her first husband by an East India Company official named Gerard Gustavus Ducarel. But looking at the letters, signs were everywhere that this woman was in fact Muslim. For instance,
I just made you fresh coffee, Tom.
would you mind? Oh, I'm actually going to mute. Yeah. I am going to find the Persian seal. So for instance, the Persian seal that she most likely used to sign the bottom of her correspondence, which you can see a close-up of here, deployed the Arabic phrase Ba'ulut Mustafa, by the kindness of Mustafa, referring to the Prophet Muhammad. And it's dated the year 14, which I'm interpreting to mean 1214 in the Hijra calendar, which would be 1799. So what began so I became fascinated by the contradictions at play in this archive, and also very excited to see such a rare collection highlighting the highlighting aspects of the life of a woman who otherwise seemed to have been lost to history. So what began as a process of honing my skills in Mughal Persian, a process that still continues and has benefited greatly from the collaboration of Hallie Nell Swanson and Ali Nouri on the team, as well as Basharat Khan at the American Institute of India Studies in Lucknow. So that was a big part of learning how to more robustly the Persian letters, one of which you can see here. I also began to research and gain capacities in thinking through textiles, jewelry, metalwork, and scent. And this project has spurred a great deal of thinking for me about the right ways of engaging with family archives and the archives of women or any person that can lose important components, whose archive can lose important aspects of contextual meaning when they're removed from the homes of families and communities in which they have gained particular meaning. So in this case, especially, I noticed that this collection, which altogether has a kind of coherence, could very quickly become fragmented, and probably will become fragmented when the actual material items become siphoned off to either different members of the family or different types of archival institutions that are prepared to host them. And so a big part of this project, and I'm now moving to the scholarship tab and working with family archives. I'll shift this so you can see it better in one moment. I want you to be able to see. So you can see DH and Family Archives is the tab I'm on now. So I began from the very start so after a couple of years of working on the project on my own, I benefited from the wonderful collaboration of Professor Sneha Krishnan at the University of Oxford for a few years. We got the John Fell Fund grant in order to facilitate the digitizing of the archival materials. And we also thought very carefully about what types of principles we wanted to enshrine in this very slow process in order to hopefully create a model for ethically engaging with family archives that could then be applied to future projects of working with women's archives by me, personally as a researcher, but also fostering conversation about what that looks like for other scholars as well. And so you can see here the principles that guide the project: transparency, providing information to families about what will happen to their materials and who will have access to them, thinking about the benefits of digitizing archives instead of trying to acquire the physical items. So by borrowing the items, digitizing images of them, and returning the items to the family, I feel that this is a more sustainable model for thinking about, for allowing those items to still maintain, a life within the families that they have been fostered in for so many generations. And on this page, you can also read more about the Palmer family themselves. Dowager Lady Palmer, and sadly, the Lord John Palmer did pass away a few years ago. His widow, Dowager Lady Palmer, has provided her own account of how she became aware of these items, and how she became committed to preserving them and also learning more about them. So I really encourage you to take a look at that when you have a bit more time. And another important aspect of the digital exhibit is giving materials that can enable teachers to use this archive in their lesson plans. And so under teaching resources, reading resources, and the bibliography for scholars provides two different types of material that will allow hopefully teachers to make this contextualize this archive and also integrate it into their teaching. So you can see here, so the wonderful undergraduate research assistant Emma Canera, who's at Barnard, helped compile under my supervision an annotated bibliography of some of what I think are the most essential texts for contextualizing archives like this one. And then finally, the exhibits, which So the exhibits, which are under this tab, which are mostly short articles at this point, talking a little bit about some of the materials and contextualizing them, were written by a number of different people in the project. And so we can see Hallie's exhibit article, Law and Land, contextualizes several of the items in the context of thinking about how land ownership in 18th century Bengal worked, because much of the correspondence was between Elizabeth Chauvinist's brothers and Elizabeth Chauvinist's husband. And the family relationship clearly created relationships of obligations between the brothers and her husband, but it's also important to understand what the vocabularies at play in the correspondence were in order to understand how those tensions were being negotiated in text. All right, so I've talked too long already, I see, and I'm sorry, but I can't end this short introduction to this project without just a whole host of thank yous. And so I'll go to the homepage here where I've tried to list, and I can't even list everyone here for a variety of reasons. I'm not able to list all the names, and I can talk more about that in a little bit. But while I am the principal investigator of this project, and it has been a true collaboration in the deepest sense of the word. And this website continues to develop, and I hope will continue to develop as I work on my book project, so that it becomes something separate, but also connected to my research. My first thank you, of course, has to go to the descendants of Elizabeth Chauvinista, those who I've been able to track down so far. I did travel to Calcutta 2 months ago and found a number of leads to get closer to her Indian descendants. But in the meantime, I need to thank Dowager Lady Diane Palmer and her late husband, John Palmer, who have been, and in the case of Diane, continue to be extremely generous with their time and energy over the last several years. Without their dedication to protecting their ancestors' archive and their openness to learning more about their ancestors' history, we would not have gotten anywhere with this project. I'm also very grateful to my co-principal investigator, Sneha Krishnan, who worked with me between years 3 and 6 on this project to co-manage the grant from the John Fell Fund to facilitate to borrowing these archival materials and digitizing them, and also working with Manaza Abdikar, who I see is in the room, to do archival research related to the project. So with that in mind, I have listed all of the funding bodies here that I've been able to get small grants from. So this project has really been a labor of love. So over the years, I've just piecemeal been able to garner some extremely generous but relatively small grants to make this work while I've been working on other projects as well. But I want to emphasize that this project has benefited from the hard work of Max Dukin, who's the lead digital designer and DH specialist on the team, Ali Nouri, the lead Persian translator and also DH specialist, Hallie Swanson, Persian translator and archival research, and Manaza Ebdekar, the archival researcher who worked on the project when Sneha and I were working together with the John Fell Fund specifically. Thank you very much. And there have also been several undergraduate research assistants who've done amazing work helping to structure and record the metadata and also give crucial feedback on the design of the site. So Michael Gorlitz, Siddharth Kandri, Emma Canera, Juliana Liu, and Fisher Taylor. So I will with this last little caveat that this continues to be a work in progress, and that's a big part of both the reality of the project, but also the ethics of the project. I just want to say I look forward to this conversation and developing this approach as a model for how to engage ethically with family archives.
Thanks
And
so
then
much.
I
Yeah,
would
no,
love, should I hand it over to you, Yael, now? Is that so? Yael Rice, I don't know if Holly wanted to say anything, but I'm really grateful to Yael for being here today to talk about this project a little bit and kick off the conversation.
it's really my pleasure. I have thoroughly enjoyed exploring this site, which, as many present here know, especially those who actually worked on it, it is richly layered, and I've found it rewarding to go back again and again. There's also the American Historical Review podcast, which is also a great listen, and of course, Megan's article that expands further in obviously article length form on the work that she's done. I thought maybe we could start off with the title of the digital project, Unstable Archives. And I was curious to hear your thoughts, Megan, about what this characterization, that being unstable, says or could say about archives, women's subjectivities, and scholarship more broadly.
Yeah, what a great question. I think that name is a very important part of the project for me, because part of embedding the name Unstable to this project is to keep front of mind at all times that archives are always a process of negotiation. So similar to my first book, Print in the Urdu Public, talked a lot about how publics are always a category of interpretation rather than something that's just a repository of knowledge. And I think of archives in a similar way. They're constantly being negotiated, they're constantly being reaffirmed, reconstituted, depending on how we engage with them. And so one of the huge opportunities as well as challenges of the digital moment, right, over the last 30 years is, on the one hand, there are new and exciting opportunities to engage with and reconstitute the archive, but also it can be very tempting to unthinkingly absorb elements of the way that archives have been structured in the past as well. And so by including the name Unstable in the title, I wanted to continue daily to remind myself that all the conclusions that we draw from the archive are always necessarily temporary is not the right word. I'm sorry that the word is escaping me, but they are kind of contingent on the information that we have available to us, and we need to embrace that instability, listen hard to the silences that exist in those archives, and remain flexible, both as new information comes to light, but also listen just as hard to the silences and be open to the likelihood in this case that there was a form of violence that occurred in constituting the archive as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, along those lines, it also raises other kinds of, for me, resonances about the instability of digital spaces. But by the same token, there is something about this project, and probably a lot of projects, that would lend themselves to a sort of digital iteration, because the digital would permit editing, would permit a kind of degree of instability and transparent instability, which I find reverberates throughout this project. But the other side of the coin is the issue of technological sustainability, and I understand that's something that you've talked about quite a bit with your collaborators. And so that's one side of it, right? The digital, how it both kind of captures or is a suitable form of representation for a project like this, but is itself unstable. But also that these archives, as you've made readily clear, are unstable to, they are in a sense kind of preserved, right, through the
Yes.
digitization and representation
Yeah.
of the project, but
Mhm.
they will be further possibly likely divided, as as time goes on.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for those thoughts. I'm not interrupting you, am I?
No,
I
no, no,
was
no, no,
riff
no.
off of that. I
Yeah,
think the
please.
point about the instability of digital spaces is a wonderful one. And, in very in very true to fashion, this project, there's two sides of that coin. On the one hand, the instability is so exciting because it allows for flexibility, it allows for creativity. I think I was mentioning to Yael when we were talking earlier this week that in an earlier iteration of this project, and Max, who I think is, yes, Max is here, can tell you, I had all of these grand visions of like, oh, we should make this public sourced and people should be able to like tweak the archive, as they go along, or suggest feedback in live form. And I still have this long-term ambition to incorporate more of that kind of crowdsourcing aspect into archives like this. But in that case, there was just a barrier in terms of time and energy, and in the case of me, technical expertise to make that happen. So on the one hand, there's what can seem like boundless creativity that digital spaces enable. But on the other hand, even in that context of creativity, I found myself still depending on unthinkingly on certain types of categories. So for those of you who were not part of Yael's and my conversation on Monday, which was so exciting, she was asking about metadata categories and how, how we decided to choose the categories that we use. And to be honest, I worked and benefited from the guidance of Mitch Frass at the University of Pennsylvania Library System, who taught me so much about standards of recording metadata. And that was very important as a part of the process, because another component of the instability of digital spaces is we see this efflorescence of websites and then no plan for stewardship in the long term. And so I didn't want this website to be something that popped up, was really cool for 6 months or a year, and then once it disappeared, or once a link broke, or once heaven forbid I got sick, or I had to something happened to me and I lost my attention. I didn't want it to be lost. I'm very committed to making this available, but I didn't want it one day to be lost. So from the very start, I wanted to talk to the University of Pennsylvania about what they call ingesting the archive into their library system. And when I say ingesting the archive, to be clear, the physical items still remain with the family in England. These are just images that are being ingested into the Penn system, but Penn did agree to steward them, indefinitely, which is a major boon and kind of counters the inherent instability of this otherwise super creative place. But on the I'm so sorry, lost my train of thought temporarily. But but another really exciting thing about that partnership is that on the one hand, the photos get to be in a standard secure place and actually be stored on that server, and we can kind of draw from them and play around with ways of highlighting their relevance to scholars. And another thing, Yal, you mentioned was about how to what extent does the digital environment offer a suitable representation of the materials. And I touched on this a little bit in the intro, but I mean, there's been a great deal of excellent scholarship done on how archives of colonized peoples end up decontextualizing the object when they're ingested into different archival contexts, and they end up being set apart, labeled, placed in a literal box that hides the elements of its past life. And to some extent, I mean, to a great extent, all of these images, they're literally in boxes. They are reminiscent of, a very traditional archive in some ways, but also the physical item itself is not living in this digital space only. It also remains within the family context where they have autonomy and agency to determine what that community-centered life of the object will continue to be. And I think that's one thing that renders digital spaces particularly appropriate for representing these type of objects where there is such a problematic history of acquisition instead of contextualization.
Thanks for that. I really appreciate your response to those questions, and building upon that, what came out of a previous conversation that we had also addressed issues around the technological infrastructure, and how you and your collaborators really aimed for the sustainability of the kind of underlying architecture, which in my experience at least has run counter to some of the ethos in college and university circles, that you know, call upon IT or your colleagues in comp sci to kind of engineer something that's, you know, very, very fine-tuned, fancy, and basically not replicable, and then breaks down once, you know, it's not maintained. And it was clear that in this case, your team and you and your team really aim to use, I guess you're using Wax, which is a kind of packaged, right, program that you can then customize. And I think that's really important. It was helpful for me, and I hope for others here who are interested in creating and stewarding digital projects, that, you know, the custom project is not always the best route to go.
Yeah, that is such a good point. And you're bringing me back to long conversations that Max and I had early on in the design of this project. And I have to also thank Penn Price Lab as well. So the Penn Price Lab was such a great resource in terms of providing funding for graduate student research support, but also being there as sounding boards for so I had several meetings with the wonderful staff at Penn Price Lab to just talk about what the goals were. So a few things that are important for developing an archive that's truly open access and isn't just accessible to high internet bandwidth contexts in the global north is to think about, how do you make a site that's not just simple enough to be sustained over time, but also just simple enough to download it easily, that doesn't need high internet bandwidths. A lot of people in South Asia that are hopefully as this archive gains, you know, more people become more aware of this, they will be engaging with it on their phones, right? And so we needed to make sure that even though the photos could be archival quality, if you looked at the Penn site, that there was the ability for people to not use huge amounts of data to access the photographs, because that would be the equivalent of making this archive not at all open access, but instead extremely, extremely expensive to engage with. And I'm so glad that you mentioned the Wax package. And, you know, Max is here. Please feel free to add comments in the in the chat, Max, or you could just unmute yourself and interject at any point. Max has been so wonderful in this process of you know, working from the very start in mapping out the website. I think that along with Penn Price Lab, we all agreed that Wax seemed to be the package that gave the most amount of flexibility, but also was least at risk of becoming extremely obsolete very quickly, right? And so that combination of simplicity, sustainability, and relative accessibility to, there we go, we have an emoji. Great. Yeah. Max said, hey, I agree with everything Yael said about the benefits of customizing a project. Yeah. And I think Wax, I mean, I hope you'll agree, Max. I think that this was a really good framework that allowed us to customize things, keep it simple and streamlined. And also, I like to think kind of become part of a community of people in the DH world who are playing with this package and seeing how to make it work for their project.
That makes a lot of sense.
Max just unmuted himself. Do you want to say something? Say something, Max.
Oh, yeah, no, I'll just say, one, I totally agree, Megan. I think it's a ideally we can contribute to Minicomp, not just take from Minicomp and produce. I mean, we talked about this a lot. There's a lot of documentation for other scholars who use Wax in their own projects. I will say it's still is a ton of work, Megan. I mean, you and I both for years now. But yeah, Wax is great, and we saved ourselves so much time. We allocated so much more time to to digitizing, to transcribing, to all of those sorts of tasks rather than designing the architecture from the ground up. So to me, that's like the cost benefit analysis of that.
Yeah.
I'll talk about the time.
Yeah, and I think the point about documentation is a really important one too. And I was really grateful to Max for every step of the way. He was very conscientious about documenting even for internal records, but also making sure that building in that, you know, metadata was available, that we thought really conscientiously about how to define metadata. Oh, this reminds me of my train of thought from earlier. I basically adopted the categories that Penn laid out for metadata. But then as we got into the actual materials and we were reporting the metadata, it became really clear that some of those categories needed to be tweaked for this particular archive. And that spurred a really interesting moment of reflection about, you know, the limits of, you know, what those really standard metadata categories are that libraries like Penn are working with. So the metadata that we have on the website, it suits a library system like Penn's, but also has some differences. So we erred on the side of having a huge amount of keywords, right? With a lot of overlap and a lot of redundancy to make sure that, I mean, in an ideal world, it would be great to have like multilingual keywords as well. But for now, there are some non-English words in the keywords, but it was designed with a sense of trying to be capacious. And then there were some categories that ended up being, you know, less relevant to this particular archive. And I'm again reminded of our conversation we had earlier this week, Yael, where you talked about how sometimes it's important to highlight that the maker is unknown of something instead of simply leaving out the name of a maker, because that what you said was really thoughtful and really impactful for me, because you're right. In the system, if you just simply leave it blank, it can just disappear. And it feels like the maker, the non-existence of the maker isn't a significant fact in the archival history. And I think we erred on the side of really documenting those silences and documenting those erasures. And that was an important part of the project too.
This is a great segue actually to my next question. And in the interest of time, well, I'm going to ask my question and then we will segue into a Q&A. I have other questions I want to talk about. Love to hear more about metadata. Like to talk about metadata all the time. I also want to hear more about the process of collaboration, but maybe we can get into that during the Q&A. But about silence, I was so struck, Megan, that there are various places embedded in the digital project where there's a palpable transparency around silence. It's made loud, it's made visible. For example, in the timeline, there is, I'm not telling you this, Megan, you know this, but for everyone else here, there's a whole section in the timeline that covers 10 years, 1770 to 1780, and what is said to have happened during that period, but an absence of records. And I loved that because it is really
sharing that.
There it is. Thank you. Really shining a light on gaps. And this is, you know, questions that have come up in conversations I've had with students recently about, you know, how to be transparent, why we should be transparent about what we don't have access to, and also how to be and why to be transparent about our uncertainty around, you know, our sources. And I was wondering if you could speak to that again. I know it's a really, really broad question, but maybe specifically to this issue of the history of gender and women's lives.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question. And it has been a journey over the course of the project. I really do think that I began the project with, I know that I began the project like 9 years ago with this goal of uncovering Elizabeth Sharaf un-Nisa, retrieving her from archival obscurity. And I really, so unfortunately, Professor Krishnan was not able to make it today. She's on sabbatical at the moment, doing an amazing fellowship and is unavailable. But I have to credit a conversation I had with her in a workshop about my article she really challenged me hard in thinking about, because I had in I had in the article language about like unearthing and retrieving and that being a part of the goal. And she really pressed me to think about what is dangerous about that particular goal in a project like this. And so that spurred me to do some deep thinking and also reading, and realize that, I mean, as scholars, this is getting a little bit into the psychology and arrogance of us as a class of people. We want to believe that as historians, we're able to undo the violence of the past by reconstituting and reconstructing what has been lost. And I think that I think particularly in the context of colonial contexts, where my positionality as a scholar in a very elite institution in the global north, looking at a woman who is, her legacy is deeply embedded in the global south, as well as part of her legacy being embedded in the global north. I need to take very seriously and weave into the very core of my project the goal to highlight how there have been irretrievable losses and unremedied and unremediable violences in the sense of archival erasures. And I think that's important to check our hubris as scholars, but also avoid what Tuck and Wang have called a claim to innocence, right? Where scholars doing work on colonized people can convince themselves that we are able to undo colonial violence through historical work. I think on a personal level, I can understand the pull and draw of that. We get into scholarship because we wish to make a positive impact on the world. But I think in this case, it's essentially important to sit with things like this, like you see in the screenshot. And I also want to highlight how I didn't get there on my own. It was not an easy process, and it was not something that necessarily came easily. So in the case of the family archive, very early on, I noticed that in this extremely well-documented family archive, there was a decade of correspondence that was just missing. And it corresponds with the decade when Gerard Gustavus and Elizabeth Sharaf had the majority of their children, when he would have met her, when he would have told his family about her, when if they did get married in a Muslim ceremony in India, that would have happened. So their formal English marriage didn't happen until 1784. But one thing that my undergraduate research assistant, Emma Canera, has explored, and I will, look at in her 2 exhibit articles, Law and Interracial Marriage and Attitudes Towards Interracial Marriage, she does an excellent job of calling attention to the ways that, it's tempting to think about the real marriage as being the 1784 marriage. But most likely there was a nikah or Muslim marriage ceremony that happened in the 1770s, especially because there's so much evidence that there was a strong sense of familial bond between Elizabeth Sharaf brothers and Gerard Gustavus. So that's another erasure, right? And silence that's happened that again, I fell victim to the seduction of initially, and collaboration and contestation has brought me to a greater awareness of that. So those are some of my initial thoughts about the importance of silence and erasures. Do you think that's sufficient for now, or is there any other aspect?
Yeah, I will just add very, very briefly, because I think we should move on to Q&A, that I also appreciated how you address this issue of silence with regards to sort of the sort of ethics of stewardship, the fact that she, of course, has living descendants. And in the case of, this being a potential model for doing family archival projects in South Asia, that one should be sensitive to the living communities that possess, a sense of ownership or connection to these lives. And I'll just say for everyone here, I encourage you to also read, I forget exactly where it is on the site, but Megan also draws on scholarship specific to the stewardship and cataloging of Indigenous collections. I've also found those materials really, really inspiring. So I was really happy to see that connection made there. But with that, I think, Holly should bring us into the Q&A.
Well, thank you so much for that fascinating presentation and for those really interesting questions that you've raised so far. So I would just encourage everybody, if you have a question, please put it into our chat. We're also kind of looks like small a group of people who seems many of you already know each other. So if you also just want to come off of mute and ask your question, please feel free to do that as well. So I guess I'll just start as kind of a complete outsider to this project. And I just wondered, Megan, what kind of sensitivities you kind of talked about this, but what sensitivities you might have felt towards the living family members? And did you feel any responsibility before you put things out there or before you publish something or you find out a tidbit? Do you feel any need to share
Oh,
your
absolutely.
findings?
Yeah, that's a great question because I was working with family archives is not a scalable project because it involves building and doing your best to sustain relationships of trust. And that is not efficient, nor should it be, right? So in the case of this particular project, one reason why I am so grateful to the Palmers is they were extremely open with the results, with me following the results of my research, and really trusted me to explore the history of their ancestor, even when it went counter to, in some cases, long-held family beliefs. So one of those instances was her religious identity. So they really strongly believed that she was, with good reason, by the way, like I'll talk about why, but they had read a translation of a text by a travelogue from the early 1800s. So a man named Mirza Abu Talib Mirza Abu Talib Khan, he had met Elizabeth Sharaf un-Nisa and written an account of her in his book. And so the family had read the account of this travelogue in William Dalrymple's White Mughals. But one issue was that the translation used in White Mughals was certainly a correct transcription of the translation of the English translation done in the 19th century, but it turned out to be very different from the Persian original. And so looking back at the Persian original brought a lot more information to light, that she came from an Ashraf, meaning elite Muslim family. And also the Persian account said that the traveler found Gerard Gustavus Ducarel completely crazy. That he said, this man is completely nuts, and I didn't want to spend any time with him anymore. She was great. He was a weirdo. I left and I never went back again. And so what had happened is the English translator, who was of course deeply embedded in the colonial project of the East India Company, was like, well, this does not protect the dignity of European servants of the empire. And so he had fabricated a tale of her husband rescuing her from the funeral pyre of her first husband. And it was complete fabrication that had nothing to do with the original Persian text. So uncovering that trail was something that was initially very, I think it's fair to say it was a bit stressful and anxiety provoking for the family. I think now in contemporary England, Islam is something that not necessarily people know a ton about. It can be something that's very jarring when if you haven't been exposed to a cultural context that you're unfamiliar with. But they remained open and part of that conversation, and ultimately were very they were very interested and I think excited that they were learning more about their answers. But that was one tender moment that had to be navigated carefully and cautiously. And then other moments were when I found evidence to suggest that she was only 12 when she met Gerard Gustavus Ducarel, and that their first child was born when she was 13. Now, on the one hand, younger marriages in the South Asian context were very common at that point. But on the other hand, I mean, even the Mughal emperor at that point had said 14 was the minimum acceptable age, you know, for formal marriages in any case. So that was another realization that it's not so much that it was a fact, at least as far as the data, you know, indicated it, but kind of sitting with that information and sharing that multiple times in person and talking about it during visits before writing about it, I think was helpful. I mean, you'd have to ask. Unfortunately, they're not able to join us today, but I'm hoping that was that was helpful. And I shared drafts of my articles beforehand, not with any offer to change content, but with the sincere desire to share the results of my research as I discovered new things. And that was something that happened over a process of years. And so by the time publications have come out, none of this is a surprise to the family. But at any time they could say, I don't want you to talk about that, right? Or I don't want you to share a document, and there have been some cases, 1 or 2, where I have self-censored because I didn't think that the information at this point was essential to this stage of the process. And I was honestly being slightly protective of them, considering they're not academics. And I knew how some information in the family archive could hit that could expose them to risk that they weren't aware of. And so, to be honest, and I won't talk about those facts, but those are some decisions I've made.
Aisha, please.
Hi, Megan. Thank you so much for this amazing project and also for talking about it so eloquently. I'm sorry I joined the conversation late because I have a student crisis. It's the end of the semester.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, thank you so much for coming.
So I actually have a larger question for you, which is, in the process of doing this work, and you know, I'm curious how representative is the wrong word, but to what extent is this a kind of outlier case, and to what extent is this actually a kind of index of many other complicated kind of marriages in the colonial context? And you know, is there, I mean, you know, in what sense can we extrapolate from this or use this as a way to think more capaciously about these kinds of relationships? I mean, there's some work in the South Asian context of these sorts of intermarriages. There's some work in the kind of larger Iberian context for the early modern world. But since so much of this information is in family archives that may not survive, or that may be kind of, you know, not ever reach kind of academic consciousness in some sense, for all of the reasons that I think you outline in this project, I'm just kind of curious about what your assessment of that is, but also, you know, what's the kind of future for this sort of work, either for you or for other people you see sort of taking inspiration from where you've been?
That is a fantastic question. Thank you so much for coming and also asking that. And so this is a micro study, first of all. So the methodology is micro, and it is very narrowly and obsessively focused on this particular person. And part of that is I like the methodology of microhistory as a way of working from the inside out. And also it's just a rare archive. So what an exciting opportunity to do work that's often not possible. Because much of the work that's been written, excellent work that I depend on heavily on, and I'm using the word native in the sense that Durba Ghosh uses the word native. She thinks it's very important to think about women who are cohabitating with East India Company officials with that term. A lot of the work that has been done by Indrani Chatterjee, by Durba Ghosh, and also by Michael Fisher, for example, has focused on, actually Michael Fisher's work is an exception, but has focused on colonial archives, right? So read against the grain legal sources that have an amazing and fascinating amount of information about women in the context of legal cases. So Durba Ghosh does this amazing work with the British Library Archive, or did this amazing work with the British Library Archives, where she looks at court cases where women are suing for property, or they're being accused of crimes, or they're trying to make sure that they continue to get stipends after the death of, you know, East India Company officials who they were cohabiting with or married to. And that is beautiful, important, and compelling work. And I think my work definitely reaffirms many of the conclusions of Durga Ghosh, right? Because she also emphasizes hybridity. She says, this is not the case of like, you know, self and other, or, you know, these are moments where we see women engaging creatively to create new types of cultural subjectivities. So I see my work as an extension of that. But I think that what this points to is, similarly to work of Ghosh and Chatterjee, these are much more common relationships than we give them credit for, right? So even if this particular manifestation of the relationship was unusual, and it was unusual because she went back to England and she married him officially and kind of absorbed herself into British society. And in terms of what we have documented, that is an unusual story. But the cohabitations were not unusual. And the fact that now we found one example of a woman doing this suggests to me that there were probably others. There were probably many others that we haven't discovered yet, and that we could be doing work on. So on the one hand, she is, according to the current archival landscape, an outlier. But I think discovering this case should invite us to think more about if it's possible to learn more about similar women. And a second point, because you reminded me of, and this relates more to the article that I wrote in the book. I mean, I've always found Durga Ghosh's, so she's written this wonderful book, Sex in the Colonial Family, that I've read like now, I don't know how many times I've read it. I just love it. And she talks about hybridity, and she talks about the importance of, you know, not assuming a kind of essentialized self, you know, that is that is separate from the cultural surroundings that they interact with. But I think that my research, I really want to explore and push on that idea even more. So I make the uncommon choice to really engage with Bourdieu's theories of habitus, to think about subjectivity. So one thing I've noticed in work on South Asia is a tendency to sometimes assume that in the colonial period, Native women are kind of undiluted or kind of pure when they're not engaging with colonial cultural forces. And when they are engaging with colonial forces, they are always necessarily being strategic. There is always necessarily that sense of power play that assumes a really like essentialized subjectivity, right? That always remains impervious to cultural influences. And that's just not what I'm seeing in this archive, right? I am seeing her change. She is becoming Elizabeth, right? And that's a weird, and that's a, I mean, to be like really flippant about it, on the one hand, it's an uncomfortable thing because you're, by the 1815, when she's writing to her sons in English, she has transformed in some way that indicates, I think, the force of theories like habitus, that we are, as we're structuring ourselves and to fit into certain cultural surroundings, we are also shaping ourselves as well. And so I think that's, first of all, I think it accurately represents the archive for sure, but I think it also helps us push past what can be neat dichotomies between an essentialized self separate from colonialism and figures that are navigating their lives in colonial systems while taking seriously unequal dynamics of power, while taking seriously the existence of coercion and the distinct possibilities for oppression. Does that, I hope that answers your question or concerns, but happy to talk more.
Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for that question. I loved it because I hadn't had a chance to think about that. And that's a really important part of this project for me.
Thank you. I mean, I pointed out your project to a student of mine, actually, and in part just to sort of make the point that, if we think about this in contemporary terms, I mean, people move across the world all the time and like become different selves and speak different languages and, sometimes take on different identities and names than they might have had they been, wherever it is they grew up. And so it seems strange that we have so much trouble attributing that malleability or flexibility of self-making to historical actors, right? And I think that your work really brings that to the fore in this really powerful way. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for saying that, because that really is a really important part of the research part of this project, because I think it doesn't, I mean, I can understand why there's pushback against that, right? There's a fear that we might be undermining really important political aims, right? By emphasizing, oh, hybridity and, dilution. But I think so I think the work of Indrani Chatterjee and Durba Ghosh was essential as a foundation for the work that now I'm doing. So that's why I want to continue to affirm that, first of all, we need to take seriously the violence and the unequal, relationships of power. That always has to be there. And that's why erasures and silences is there too. But I think there is so much to be gained from taking seriously that process of transformation. Anyway, thank you again.
Just want to pitch in here that, and I'm sure this is something that you and your team has wrestled with, but the controlled vocabularies don't actually have the kind of flexibility and the latitude to accommodate those complex subjectivities. So anyway, it's all iterative. It kind of feeds into the project, the scholarship, and then again, the vocabularies that we use for metadata.
Yes.
So it's exciting, that this project really addresses all of that head on.
Yeah, and so ideally, wouldn't it have been nice to just create your own project independently with your own categories of metadata that perfectly fit this project? That also would have been great. But then on the other hand, I was balancing that against this desire to preserve some version of the archive for a future generation. So it's it's very well illustrating that process of transformation and also strategy that's at play when we're trying to recount what we know of a woman's life.
Well, thank you everybody so much for coming. Thank you to Megan and to Yael. Thank you for your questions, everyone. Just to wrap up, I want to let everybody know about our next book party, which will be in the new year. So thanks for closing out 2023 so well for us, everybody here today. 2024, January 11th, we have another archival project, Invisible Archives. Margaret Galvan will be in conversation with Allison Fraser on queer and feminist culture in the 1980s. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much all
for the new year. Bye.